So tomorrow night from the Toyota Center in Houston, Texas, the UFC heavyweight division is going to become a little bit more dramatic, if not necessarily more interesting. Tomorrow night is going to be the night that the UFC is going to decide its interim heavyweight championship of the world between Derrick Lewis and Cyril Gane. Pardon me, Cyril Gane. I don't normally make that mistake, but regardless, let's move on. There's a lot to be said about this fight. I mean, it's kind of if you were to just talk about the fight itself, I mean, there's a lot to talk about there. The simple fact of the matter is that it doesn't really seem like an interim heavyweight championship of the world is even necessary at this time. It seems like the difference between the time when Francis Ngannou was ready to defend the actual world heavyweight championship, and Dana White's window, for his pay-per-view purposes, scheduling purposes, was literally about a month. It sounded like Dana White could do it maybe as late as September. Francis Ngannou thought that he could do it as early as October. It doesn't really seem like there are a lot of good reasons why we're actually getting an interim heavyweight championship at all. But regardless of whether or not there's a good reason to have this championship, regardless of whether or not there's good reason to take an interim championship seriously at all, and to be honest with you, I think that that's very seldom the case where an interim championship should be taken seriously. The one thing that absolutely must be taken seriously in this situation is the two competitors, Derrick Lewis and Cyril Gane. They are both their top contenders for a reason. They probably should be the next guys in line for Francis Ngannou for a reason. But of these two fighters, in my opinion, the one that's more interesting to me, particularly as of late, is Derrick Lewis. And it seems to me that there was a time in the history of combat sports when it's actually possible that maybe Derrick Lewis would not be the kind of beloved figure that he is in the sport today. And I do think that that's a shame, but the more that I kind of look at Derrick Lewis, and I know that a lot of people might actually find this to be something of an unflattering comparison. So please don't get that twisted. Before I start, I'm not saying that these two guys are the same, but I think that there are a lot of parallels and corollaries between Derrick Lewis and the former boxing world's heavyweight championship, Sonny Liston. In particular, when you look at actually the history that the two of them had before they got into combat sports. In Derrick Lewis's case, of course, it was first boxing, then MMA, and in Liston's case, it was boxing. So both of them were born into homes that had some similarities to them. I mean, I'm not going to say that they were exactly the same, but they were both homes that had domestic violence within them. In Sonny Liston's case, he was the victim of the domestic violence at his father's hands. And in Derrick Lewis's case, it was his mother who was the victim of domestic violence at the hand of Lewis's stepfather. Both of them wound up experiencing, let's say, legal problems later in life before they got into combat sports, and both of them had actually gone to jail by the time that they were in. But with the exception of the detail that it was coming out of prison that the both of them both got involved in their respective contact sport. But aside from the similarity that both of them got into their respective combat sport after coming out of prison, at that point the two stories really start to divulge, and the two of them picked different paths. Although I do think that it is fair to ask the question, if Sonny Liston had been born today, would he have had, if he were an active fighter today, would he have had better options available to him than the one that he eventually chose? And if Derrick Lewis was an active combat sports athlete all the way back when Sonny Liston was active, is it possible that maybe his choices, they would have been fewer and further in between? And so in particular, when Sonny Liston came out of jail, there were not really a whole lot of what you would call, supports for a guy in his particular situation. Not a lot of jobs available. Not a lot of help for a guy coming out of jail. The culture just wasn't at that point all the way back then. And so what eventually wound up happening was that Sonny Liston wound up going to jail, going to work for the mob as a leg breaker. And so he was one of these guys that was tightly controlled under the mafia's thumb. And in pro boxing at that particular point, that opened a lot of doors for a fighter. The mafia was very deep in professional boxing, and the one thing that everybody involved in professional boxing coveted more than anything else was the world's heavyweight championship. And it was said at the time, and it's probably still true now, that whoever controls the heavyweight championship of the world controls where the sport is going to go. And so who better to control the fate of the world's heavyweight championship than the most dominant leg breaker that the mob had? And that was Sonny Liston. But it was certainly no secret that Sonny Liston had been to jail, and possibly it was really more of a public secret that he was also working for the mafia. And so that didn't make Sonny Liston popular with the majority of boxing fans. And even when he became the world's heavyweight champion, he never did receive the kind of acknowledgement and the kind of acceptance that he had always hoped to gain. There was a story about how right after he won the championship, he went back to his hometown, and he had hoped that he was going to be greeted by all of the people of the city, and they were going to come out and finally shower him with praise and love and celebrate his accomplishment with him. But instead, what happened was that they touched down in this plane, probably provided to them by some mafia figure, and when he came off the plane, not only was there not any kind of adulation waiting for him, there was nobody there at all. And that was said to be, for a lot of people, the day that Sonny Liston had given up that dream of ever being publicly accepted. And exactly how reviled a figure was Sonny Liston? Well, it was exactly this bad. The man that he took the World Heavyweight Championship off of was Floyd Patterson. Floyd Patterson was trained by the legendary Cus D'Amato. And Cus was always telling Floyd, no, don't fight Sonny Liston. Don't give him that championship opportunity. We need to keep control of this championship and keep it away from the mob. But then something happened. Floyd Patterson visited the office of the President of the United States, the Oval Office. And it was none other than John F. Kennedy. And Sonny Liston was such a reviled figure that none other than John F. Kennedy actually said to him, it's like, I think that you need to fight Sonny Liston, and we all need you to defeat Sonny Liston. And unfortunately, as the story continues, that didn't happen. Floyd Patterson, he went into that ring and he was subject to some of the fiercest intimidation in boxing history. And there were people there who said that it looked like Floyd Patterson could barely get into the ring with Sonny Liston. And Liston absolutely tore through him, knocked him out, took the World Heavyweight Championship back into the sphere of the mafia. And he would hold on to that until he ran into none other than Cassius Clay, the man who would eventually become known as Muhammad Ali. He wasn't fighting under that name yet. But Sonny Liston gave up his world's heavyweight championship sitting on the stool between rounds. He just simply knew that Muhammad Ali was too good a fighter, and Ali broke him, completely demolished his will to fight. And there are a lot of people who think that if it wasn't for that public rejection by the people of his home city, that was what planted the seeds of Sonny Liston's eventual meltdown. And so now, today, flash forward 60 years, and now we have this character, this Derrick Lewis. He is, certainly, I don't think it's unfair to describe him as a character. He definitely is. And he comes into the sport of MMA, although it wasn't really his first, it was maybe his first choice, but it wasn't the sport that first chose him. He first got into combat sports because George Foreman saw something special in him and thought that he would become a great championship boxer. He eventually kind of, discovered this sport, MMA, decided that he liked it better, and that's what he pursues now. But I think in a lot of ways, by no small measure, I think that might have been the difference between Derrick Lewis and Sonny Liston, or at least one of the differences. Because was that Derrick Lewis did find a lot more support coming out of prison than Sonny Liston did. I mean, hey, let's make no bones about it. There wasn't what I would call an appropriate degree of support for Derrick Lewis all along the way. Because the truth be told, that if there had been, he never would have gone to prison in the first place. The only reason why he ever actually did any time was because he couldn't find anybody to help him, pay his legal expenses and pay his fines that he had gotten from this altercation with this other man that he had been in this fight with. He was a poor college student. He couldn't afford to pay these fines. He couldn't even afford to travel to some of his court appearances, and that was what eventually wound up having him go into jail in the first place. But there did seem to be an awful lot more support for Derrick Lewis after the fact, after he came out of prison. And I think that we all as MMA fans should be thankful that there was, because if there wasn't, then we wouldn't have this excellent individual that we have in the sport today. And another thing that I've really become to started to wonder quite a bit as I become so much more fascinated with this figure of Cus D'Amato, is I do wonder, if he were alive today, if he had been alive and active when Derrick Lewis came out of prison, I wonder what Cus D'Amato might have seen in Derrick Lewis, and perhaps if maybe Cus D'Amato might have been the guy to try to bring him and take him under his wing and try to make him, a champion fighter. He certainly never did shy away from people who had those kinds of, for lack of a better phrase, in the case of Derrick Lewis, I won't say shady, but definitely troubled history. That was exactly what he did with Mike Tyson. And it was exactly what he did with Teddy Atlas. I mean, he probably had something to do with Teddy Atlas being able to stay out of jail in the first place. I mean, Teddy Atlas, he had kind of two forays, through that particular life. I mean, personally, I do have a suspicion that seeing the World Heavyweight Championship taken off of Floyd Patterson by this mob-affiliated fighter, Sonny Liston, that probably stuck with Cus D'Amato in a lot of ways. And I think it's fair to speculate. that maybe one of the reasons why Cus D'Amato became this redemptive figure later on in his training career was maybe in no small measure because he didn't want to see the mob ever get their hands on another fighter like Sonny Liston ever again. And not just for the kind of damage that they could inflict within the sport, but also for the damage that those people could do, to their victims when they're out doing all of this dirty work for the mob. For all of the struggles that Mike Tyson had later on in his life after Cus D'Amato passed away, I think that Cus D'Amato did help Mike Tyson an awful lot, and I think that those lessons that Cus D'Amato taught him about character probably were very, very important in helping Tyson find the right path again later in life. Thank God that he did, because I think that a lot of fight fans would not be as happy in the sport as they are today if we couldn't love Mike Tyson the way that we do now. But there was a time when that would have been a good deal more difficult. And he certainly did eventually have that effect on Teddy Atlas. And while I do think that it's extremely important to acknowledge that obviously, Derrick Lewis didn't vitally need Cus D'Amato because he did find that path on his own. But if a guy like Cus D'Amato had been there to kind of usher him along in that way, I think it is very interesting. It's a very interesting what-if scenario to kind of ask ourselves, exactly what Derrick Lewis might be now compared to what he is. And I think that is definitely in no small measure going to be a big part of what's going to make tomorrow night's fight so interesting, is that tomorrow night we are finally going to find out exactly what Derrick Lewis is.